Hi, this is Judy Saalinger from Lasting Recovery, San Diego's premier outpatient alcohol and drug treatment center. And today we're talking about
So let's talk about how an individual might develop a casual relationship with substances, which might even include the choice not to have any relationship in some cases, oftentimes. And then we'll look at how that differentiates with the relationships that's developed in addiction. Most individuals enjoy being intoxicated, interestingly. And there's some different numbers that are thrown around, but basically, about a third of all adult human beings actually enjoy the sensation of having some measure of intoxication. Maybe not quite the way that an addict, not blackout drunk, but having a little bit of a buzz on. A lot of people find that experience pleasurable. And because it's pleasurable, they're likely to seek it out. About a third of all human beings actually don't find the experience of intoxication very pleasurable, and so they're going to be developing a relationship around perhaps either avoidance or somehow integrating substance use into their life in a way that's that does provide them some sort of benefit, but not any cost. So let's look at how most people would develop a relationship with a substance, and I'm going to use alcohol as an example, but it's certainly alcohol and cannabis are going to be the main ones. And just to give you an idea, in the United States, I think the latest figure is about 90% of all high school students will have used the drug ethyl alcohol, which you might know as vodka, wine, beer, etc., before they graduate from high school. And roughly just over 60% of all high school students will have smoked cannabis before they leave high school. So most people, by the time they reach adulthood, have experienced this phenomenon of intoxication. Very few people in the United States reach adulthood without some familiarity with that. And yet only 10% of people are addicts. The way this usually works is most individuals will experiment with this phenomenon of substance use and eventually will run into some sort of negative consequences. Maybe they embarrass themselves, they get into a fight, they miss an important event, or they just felt uncomfortable with their level of ability to interface in a situation that would have been optimal for them. And these are negative consequences. And as a result of that negative consequences, the next time the individual finds themselves in this particular situation, let's just say that 3 was delightful, these other 3 times, and then they tried 5 because some of their other friends were doing that, and 5 created consequences. It's more likely that the next time they engage in this particular environment, similar circumstances, that they might choose 4 or 3, or perhaps even 2, depending, and in some cases even none, depending on how that individual responded to that particular experience. Most people won't step it up to 7 or 8 after 5 didn't work. They're gonna be adjusting their substance use so that they continue to get rewarded in the way that they have in the past, but without the negative consequences. And as time goes on, they start to learn that 3 is okay in this situation, but in a different setting, maybe 5 was delightful. And in other situations, maybe none is optimal. And there's this natural shaping of behavior that takes place for most individuals in this way. And as an individual goes through life, they're developing this casual relationship with substances. They enjoy being intoxicated. They slowly learn that in some situations it's better than others. And there's varying degrees of intoxication that are appropriate for different settings. This is how the relationship is formed. Other individuals find that they really don't like intoxication at all. It's not enjoyable for them. Either physiologically, they respond poorly to it. They might have some adverse reactions to it, or it's just they don't like the loss of control. For these individuals, part of their relationship is going to be either how do they fit that into their social structure? In some cases, it's just going to be no longer using substances, which is interestingly is a decision made by up to a third of all adults in the United States. Limiting the number of drinks that they might have in a year, which is something that a significant portion of the population does too. Maybe having less than 11 drinks in a year, for example. And those individuals will learn how to, the individuals that choose to include substance use, usually in the form of alcohol, into their life, will do it in a way that they're not going to get intoxicated. You can have a beer and have it spread out over a period of time and enjoy social settings or whatever without any kind of negative consequences. And that is by itself and by definition certainly a casual relationship with that substance. The ability for consequences to shape behavior around substance use is one of the most noticeable differences between addicts and non-addicts. I think that it's important to look at why is it that we find something pleasurable, and what's the difference between that and other individuals, that between finding pleasure and forming a less than casual relationship with something, finding pleasure and forming a casual relationship. Let's look at the difference there. And we're going to have to move to biology to really begin to really understand addiction. And it all begins with that pleasurable experience. Now, human beings, not only human beings, actually all mammals and many other creatures, in some very primitive structures of the brain that we'll just refer to as the pleasure centers of the brain. And by the way, I just want to mention, I'm going to be talking about a lot of brain structures. I'm not going to get into the really long scientific names, et cetera. At the end of today's presentation, I will kind of mention kind of what the ones that I'm talking about are. I'll offer some additional resources for those of you that are interested in getting some more information. But I'm going to kind of speak in lay terms basically today. So we'll just refer to this as the pleasure circuitry. And the pleasure circuitry is there to help us notice things in the environment that are important to our survival. Now, some of the things that might be important to survival are going to be procreation and eating, like nutrition. And there's going to be let's play with eating, for example. There's certain materials in the environment that are really necessary for life. One of those is going to be carbohydrates. One of those is going to be fats. One of those is going to be, what we perceive as savory, but essentially amino acids, which are the building blocks for our tissue. And then salt. And these things we find pleasurable. So when we run across items that have these particular materials in it, we're kind of built to enjoy them. And there's a bunch of people trying to figure out stuff right now to put inside of boxes with just the right mix of this, because if they know that if they can come up with the right mix of this, that there's going to be this pleasure circuitry in your brain is going to kind of light up in a delightful way that makes you really remember their product and want more of it. And that's how this is designed to work. It works for sex. It works for other things that are good for me too, like gathering up the materials in order to make it through a winter. So like I would actually find achieving the kinds of things that are going to make it so that I have resources in my life available to keep myself and my offspring alive until they're able to reproduce themselves. So from a biological perspective, this is important that we have some way of prioritizing the things in the environment that are most important for our survival. And this is where addiction begins. It begins with pleasure. I'm going to use the example also today of Cinnabon. Does anybody here not like Cinnabon? Or doesn't like the smell? Well, I'll use another one, bacon. So if Cinnabon isn't working for you, use bacon. And if that doesn't work for you, use something like a cooking steak. And I'm picking these on purpose because we're getting into sweet or fatty or savory and fatty foods. And the smells of these particular things have the capacity to make us hungry, sometimes spontaneously. Well, let's look at why that happens. When we ingest these materials in the past, during some time in the past, our brain lights up in the circuitry in a way that, in a gradiated way, which means, well, I'll come back to that, but in a way that says, this is important, remember this. And as this part of our brain lights up, this pleasure circuitry, it also brings online the component of our brain that stores long-term memories, and it stores everything associated with that experience, sights, smells, sounds, etc., so that in the future, when I run across this phenomenon again, I'm able to recognize it in the environment. Now, in the case of foods, this is really important. I need to be able to, if I find something in the environment that sustains my life, say, for example, something that has a lot of carbohydrate to it, because in nature, getting enough carbohydrates in order to have the energy to get through the day is really important. If I move into another environment, it's really adaptive for me to be able to know that this is prioritized, that it's salient, and I'm able to recognize it in the environment. Maybe if I don't see it directly, I might notice that there's other things around it that tend to be correlated to that. And I might not even think that. I might just suddenly become hungry for that item just because of the other cues that I'm receiving that ignite this spontaneous drive state, which we'll call hunger in this case. Because we do have different kinds of drives that are spontaneously ignited, if you will, when we get these external cues, or internal cues, as we'll come to later. It's in this way that I have a relationship with food, and I might prioritize certain kinds of foods over other foods. It's more than likely that I'm going to have a less than casual relationship with Cinnabon, for example, than Brussels sprouts. Because Brussels sprouts, as nutritious as they are, they don't contain the kinds of things that I'm talking about here that I'm kind of more likely to find pleasurable and assign saliency or importance, if you will. This is the circuitry where addiction starts. And to understand this, I like to imagine it as like there's like this pleasure meter built into our heads. And maybe you guys have been to a carnival or something where you've seen like one of those things, you squeeze the handles and it tells you what a lover you are, red hot or lukewarm or whatever, right? You get kind of the little thing, and if you hit the top, the lights go off and everything. Well, we have one of those kind of built into our system. We have this pleasure circuitry. And the way that the lever works, the dial, the dial registers things is how fast is dopamine released in this particular circuitry? How fast and how much. And depending on the rate and intensity of this release of dopamine in the pleasure circuitry, it's kind of like our pleasure meter, right? Well, when most people experience some mild or even moderate level of intoxication, their pleasure meter says, that was cool. I'll remember this. And if I run across this particular phenomenon again in the future, I'm going to try this again because I like that. I experienced it as pleasurable. The thing that differentiates people that are going to be addicts from non-addicts is either initially or at some point during their substance use career, if you will, their pleasure circuitry does something a little bit different than that. It goes like this. That was awesome! That was the most awesome thing ever! And that's what separates addicts from non-addicts initially. It doesn't stop there, well, that's just where the journey begins. But fundamentally, that's initially the biggest difference between addicts and non-addicts is there's an unnatural release in dopamine that ascribes saliency, importance, to this particular experience that's unnatural. There is nothing about intoxication that's necessary for one's survival. It is not the same as sex or carbohydrates or salt. It isn't the same thing, but interestingly, because it produces euphoria to some degree in many individuals, it's perceived as being more salient than it is for some people that tend to develop this phenomenon that we call addiction. This, what I'll refer to as more a neurological disorder, because it's probably the most accurate description of what we're talking about here.